Welcome to the Affirming Minds Podcast, where we equip like-minded mental health professionals with a therapeutic toolkit that helps add to a more engaging, fulfilled, and effective mental health practice. Each empowering episode can stand alone as a continuing education pod course or a very valuable professional or personal resource with insightful expert interviews, practical resources, industry news, and lots of inspiration. We help the modern therapist thrive at work. Now let's welcome your host, a dedicated therapist and passionate educator, Shaina Siber, LCSW.
Welcome to the Affirming Minds Podcast. I'm your host, Shaina Siber. Today's episode is eligible for continuing education credit. To earn credit, visit affirmmentalhealth.com and join our membership, where you'll get CE access for our podcast episodes, plus workshops, self-study courses, and so much more. If you're already an Affirm Academy member, simply log in through the portal or use the link in the show notes to access the post-test and evaluation. Once you complete it, your CE certificate will be emailed to you within minutes. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave a 5-star review and comment on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps other listeners find the show and join our affirming community of learners. A quick reminder before we begin, this podcast is for educational purposes only. If you're in need of mental health treatment or clinical supervision, please reach out to a licensed professional in your area. All cases and client stories described in this episode are de-identified, vignette-based, or composite, and no protected health information is ever shared. In 2013, researchers at Emory University trained mice to fear the scent of cherry blossoms by pairing it with a mild electric shock. What's remarkable is what happened next. 2 generations later, the offspring of those men who had never experienced the shock and never had interaction with the mice who had still froze when they smelled that same cherry scent. Their DNA carried chemical markers that changed how genes related to fear were expressed. In a sense, the memory of danger had been inherited. And while humans are far more complex in some ways, we see echoes of this in therapy every day. The adult who flinches at conflict, the parent who overfunctions to prevent chaos, these often are not isolated traits or even from social learning. They are survival codes passed down across generations. Clinically, I think of generational trauma as operating on 3 intertwined levels, a synthesis informed by the work of Rachel Yehuda, Murray Bowen, and Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, 3 thinkers who forever changed how we understand the transmission of suffering. Rachel Yehuda, a neuroscientist and professor of psychiatry at Mount Sinai, has spent decades studying the biology of trauma in Holocaust survivors, combat veterans, and their children. Her research on epigenetic inheritance revealed measurable differences in stress response genes such as NR3C1 and FKB5, showing that trauma can leave a biological signature passed from parent to child. Murray Bowen, a psychiatrist and pioneer of family systems theory, shifted psychotherapy from the individual to the emotional unit of the family. He introduced the idea that anxiety, roles, and relational patterns circulate through generations via what he called the multi-generational transmission process, showing that symptoms often reflect a system's attempt to regulate itself. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, a Lakota scholar, social worker, and founder of the Historical Trauma and Unresolved Grief Intervention, expanded this conversation beyond the family to include collective and cultural dimensions of trauma. Her work named the intergenerational effects of colonization, genocide, and systemic oppression, emphasizing that healing requires both cultural restoration and social justice. Together, these 3 thinkers illuminate 3 primary pathways of transmission. 1, epigenetic, how chronic stress reshapes biology and gene expression. 2, relational, how attachment and coping patterns are modeled and repeated. And 3, cultural and systemic, how histories of oppression and displacement become embedded in collective identity. Understanding these layers allows us to perceive the intergenerational field, the invisible emotional ecosystem where biology, relationship, and history intersect. For today's conversation, we're focusing primarily on relational transmission of trauma, the space where echoes of pain and protection show up between people, in families, partnerships, caregiving dynamics, and the therapeutic relationship itself. To explore this layer, we'll be grounding our discussion into 2 overlapping frameworks: Bowenian family system theory and attachment theory. Bowenian family systems theory, developed by psychiatrist Murray Bowen in the mid-20th century, views the family as an emotional system rather than a collection of individuals. Anxiety, roles, and attachment needs circulate through the system, shaping behavior and relationships across generations. One of Bowen's key ideas is differentiation of self, the ability to remain emotionally connected while maintaining one's own sense of identity. People with higher differentiation can act from their values even amid intense emotion. Those with lower differentiation tend to merge with others' anxieties or disconnect entirely. Bowen also described the multi-generational transmission process, how unresolved family anxiety and coping patterns are passed along, creating predictable patterns, like the overfunctioner who pairs with the underfunctioner, the caretaker who raises caretakers, the conflict avoider who breeds silence. And triangulation, another core Bowenian concept, describes what happens when two people in conflict bring in a third to stabilize their tension. The system calms temporarily, but at the cost of rigidity and emotional distortion. From this perspective, symptoms like anxiety, depression, or relational distress aren't located in individuals. They're expressions of the family's emotional field. So the therapeutic goal is to help clients increase differentiation to stay connected without losing themselves. Running parallel to this system lens is attachment theory, first articulated by John Bowlby and expanded by Mary Anworth, Mary Main, and later by Daniel Siegel and Alan Shore through the lens of interpersonal neurobiology. Attachment theory explores how early caregiver relationships shape internal models of safety, love, and regulation. When caregivers are responsive and attuned, children form secure attachment, a sense that the world is safe and they are worthy of care. When caregiving is inconsistent or frightening, children develop insecure attachment. Anxious attachment is marked by vigilance and fear of abandonment. Avoidant attachment is marked by emotional distance and self-reliance as protection. And disorganized attachment is seen when the caregiver is both a source of comfort and fear. These patterns evolve into relational templates that shape how we partner, parent, and even engage in therapy. Modern attachment-based therapy shows that security can be relearned through new reparative experiences, through empathy, consistency, and co-regulation within the therapeutic relationship. When we weave Bowen's systemic thinking with Bowlby's attachment framework, a richer picture emerges. Bowen helps us understand how anxiety moves between people, while Bowlby helps us see how it becomes encoded within people. Healing generational trauma means addressing both the relational choreography that sustains old roles and the internalized expectations that keep them alive. One of the most powerful tools for exploring these dynamics is the genogram, developed in the 1970s by Monica McGoldrick and Randy Gerson, both influenced by Bowen's theory. The genogram turns systemic concepts into a concrete therapeutic exercise. A genogram looks like a family tree, but functions as a relational map. Using standardized symbols, clinicians and clients chart at least 3 generations, marking marriages, separations, losses, alliances, and emotional cutoffs. Lines and annotations capture closeness, conflict, and distance. Patterns begin to emerge. Generational lines of caretaking, avoidance, addiction, silence, or resilience are unearthed and named. My guest today, Alyssa Scarano, is a licensed professional counselor and the founder of The Collective Therapy and Wellness. Known for her empathic relational approach, Alyssa views therapy as a profound privilege, an invitation into the most intimate and vulnerable parts of her clients' lives. Alyssa's clinical work centers on helping individuals heal from childhood trauma, identify and interrupt repeating relational patterns, and cultivate compassionate self-awareness, the kind that allows people to move from survival mode into authentic connection. In this conversation, we explore what it means to notice and name those inherited family patterns, how family roles like caretaker, peacekeeper, or overfunctioner are learned and maintained, and how therapy becomes a space to experiment with new ways of relief. Alyssa talks about how mapping these dynamics, sometimes through tools like the genogram, but often through language, reflection, and self-compassion, helped clients see the invisible loyalties they have shaped their choices. The heart of this dialogue is really about relational transmission, the everyday ways trauma, love, and responsibility travel through families, and how awareness and compassion can begin to shift that inheritance. As you listen, I invite you to hold this question. What patterns are you still carrying that didn't start with you? And what are the new ones that might begin through awareness, compassion, and choice? So let's dive into my conversation with Alyssa. Alyssa, thank you so much for being here on the Affirming Minds podcast. Just so grateful to have your voice and your expertise. Before I dive in, can you tell listeners a little bit about yourself and what led you into this work and how your own experience has maybe shaped your clinical focus here on breaking generational patterns?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a long version and a short version. I'm going to try and give you the middle version and the nice sweet spot. Let's see. I actually started out straight after high school, even having no idea what I wanted to do, right? And I did, though, discover that I really liked writing and I loved reading. I loved the idea of people's stories with the character arc. And then I fell in love with nonfiction and reading about the human experience. And through my own therapy and finding the words to tell my story, that's something that I wanted to give other people. And I wanted to provide people with an experience of not being alone. And sometimes I've come to realize that sometimes that's something many people haven't experienced at all in their lives, like the chance of being with another person through something really difficult. And it's funny because when I was in grad school, we have to take family counseling is one of our classes. And I said to myself, no way, I'm never going to do family counseling. I don't want to do it. Like, it's just too much in one room. There's so much conflict. I'm never going to do it. And then straight out of grad school, my first job in the field was providing functional family therapy in the home. And I loved it. I loved it. I loved the idea of how the family system all really influences one another. I learned so much about what sustains the family system, the behaviors and the interactions, the idea of how our self talk is often influenced by the way our caregivers have spoken to us and how deep that some of these reactional or just interpersonal dynamics run, sometimes across generations. And truly, even if I'm working with an individual, I'm still working within the family system because a lot of the time we are still functioning within the roles that we've played throughout our lives in our family dynamic, whether we're actually with our family of origin or we're on to creating our family nowadays, like as adults. Or if we're amongst a friend group, we're often still playing that same role that we had to play growing up. And so working with people to step outside of that role of who you've needed to be in order to survive your family of origin, that's maybe an old coping skill or protective mechanism that helped you feel like you belonged somewhere, but also maybe not necessarily helpful anymore.
And I actually really love that you came into this work begrudgingly, right? Because I think when you develop a passion that you started with a little bit of cynicism about, I think you're at just recognizing that you know perhaps like the tender spots that maybe somebody who is going in like really like bright-eyed and bushy-tail wasn't anticipating. And I think being able to resonate, no, this work can be really hard for people and family working through family dynamic, defying maybe what kept you attached is probably such a maybe that work pulled you in, even if you didn't see yourself there initially. And it sounds like you're doing really important work in that space. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about generational patterns and what does that really mean? Specifically, how do those patterns show up in therapy? What do we see emotionally, behaviorally, or relationally when we're having that lens of keeping an eye out for generational patterns?
Yeah, so I think it starts with going back to the basics in terms of we all really at the core need to feel like we belong somewhere, want to feel accepted, want to feel loved, right? And that could be right up there, I believe, with needing food and shelter, safety, right? And so considering that from a very young, like even infancy, toddlerhood, early childhood, we learn very much how to get our needs met. And so we develop sometimes these ways of reacting, responding, and interacting with the people around us in a way that works. We're going to continue to do something if the function of the behavior provides us with what we're looking for. And so when we think about how generational patterns become sustained is that our parents and our caregivers are also parenting from how they were parented. So if there's some unresolved wounds or attachment wounds or just ways of relating that, maybe are performance based or people pleasing, and you being a child trying to exist within that dynamic, if you inherently maybe act like just naturally a little bit different or outside of that or challenging some of those norms, it might not necessarily get your needs met. And so needing to sometimes fit into the family dynamic, it will really influence the way that you act in those dynamics.
I think it's interesting you're saying that your parents are responding from a place of where they got parented. And I think that I've seen manifest in probably countless ways and in infinite sort of ways because it's so highly individualized. But I think sometimes even more interesting is seeing that there will be parents that have insight that something was painful or problematic in their own parenting. But then the translation into parenting their own child, they almost miss their child. So I'll have, folks I work with where there was potentially neglect related to poverty, right? So they didn't have their parents were really struggling to adequately feed them consistently or make sure that they had their basic needs met. So in their parenting identity, being a financial provider becomes the dominant parenting identity. And that can be at sometimes the expense of other needs or holding the complexity, or a parent has endured profound physical abuse in their childhood, excessive corporal punishment. So they make a really intense commitment to not utilizing physical aggression in their parenting, but then struggle with other forms of connection or really are verbally abusive. I think even folks, I always try to give every parent the grace of how difficult parenting is and that people are really doing the best that they can, even in generational transitions, in trying to heal and identify what may have been harmful in their own. There can also be a new pattern developed that it still has this thread to generational patterns of behavior.
Yes, absolutely. To even piggyback off of that, say that you maybe had parents who were not necessarily emotionally attuned for whatever reason. Survival and financial security maybe took precedence, making sure that those basic needs of housing and food and clothing were met. But maybe, right, that translates to a parent who is very emotionally attuned, but maybe that parent is also very anxious, right? So that anxiety might now be modeled for your child, right? Especially in interpersonal interactions or around emotions and having emotions, same unmet need from childhood. And yeah, parenting is tough. There's so much to navigate our own inner child and then whatever stressors are at bay currently within the family dynamic that you're creating.
Absolutely. What do you see as some of the most common ways early family dynamic, whether that be attachment styles, communication patterns, maybe unspoken rules, repeat across generations?
Absolutely. So I do see there are a few that I often see. One of them is people pleasing or conflict avoidance. Another is over functioning to the point of survival. The other one that I often see is really performance based, right? Of being a good girl, being a good boy, or performing well. And then that sometimes trickles down onto the children. For really, I think what's at that core is security and stability that maybe you're trying to instill in your child.
Can you speak a bit more about the over functioning? What is that? What do you see and observe there in relational patterns when someone has used over functioning as a mechanism of survival?
Yeah. So perhaps there, well, this comes from generations of one parent's over functioning because maybe there was a parent that was in the picture but not really involved, or the other parent was not involved in the picture. So one parent was really the one running the show. And in that sense, that's often carried out just because that is what is expected, or the child that grew into the adult believes that's what they have to do, or they can't rely on anybody else. They're the only ones who can get the goals met or fulfill their own needs. Relying on somebody else is really difficult. And there's different roots in many different ways because maybe that adult who, was parentified, they couldn't rely on their parents, so they can't rely on their partners. So that one right there is really a matter of, I think, going back to the sense of dependence. There's not really someone there who can pick up the slack, who I can trust to do it in the way that I would do it. Or if I was to hand off or ask for help, it would be done not the way that I would do it, or not perfectly, or not to the extent that it should be done.
Absolutely. Children, a communication around trust outside of the family unit and what that looks like in terms of what are the expectations of them, but maybe even more so, what are the capability of other people?
Correct. Yes, exactly. And sometimes we see that just even inadvertently or unconsciously being created. If let's say that you witnessed your mother growing up, really carrying the household and taking care of everything for whatever reason, maybe the father or whoever else was in the house wasn't necessarily providing or was more absentee, and the mother had to, right? The little girl in that family might grow up with the message of that's what I must do. So it's a matter of early social learning also as well of who I am and who I need to be in this world in order to keep going.
Absolutely. And I think that is such an important message to think about in family dynamics of, that we show more than we tell. And that I think a
Right.
lot of folks, myself included, a lot of what we think is getting translated in the messaging to our children is what we tell them, that here are our stated values, right? This is the stated expectations, but is that aligned with what they're seeing, living, and experiencing day in and day out? So I'm sure many caregivers in that experience of over functioning, where they're holding everything out of necessity, likely not what they want for their child or what they communicate should be their own expectations in family relationships. But there's probably a lot of intentionality that has to go into sort of identifying that and having flexibility around that.
Absolutely. And you think about how children as well learn, right? We learn by associations. And so what happens after I do this behavior? And whatever's reinforced, there's some sort of function a lot of time that is reinforced by I do this thing, I get this result. And so if I'm watching or looking at my caregivers and seeing what their behavior is providing them with, I'm learning just by example. May not even necessarily be interaction between mother and child or father and child or caregiver and child. It really could just be the child learning from their experience. Take another example of parents or caregivers often fighting. A child that's witnessing that, hearing that, seeing that, maybe on a continual basis, perhaps for valid reasons, for things that are difficult, right? We should be quote unquote fighting for our relationships. It's how we fight, absolutely. But a child who grows up with that without any context or ability to have the bird's eye view, because a child's mind is very just naturally developmentally egocentric until mid adulthood, really. They're going to learn through association of this is what happens when people fight. So that child might grow up to be conflict avoidant or to be the mediator or to be the problem solver or even perhaps the person who is funny to interrupt the fighting. That's how I think early social learnings really do play a role as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What would you say about the role compassion and mindfulness have in becoming cognizant of these cycles and in interrupting these cycles when that's possible?
I believe that really the first step is needing to have some insight. What's going on internally for me in this moment, right? What is this reaction that I'm having either internally or externally? This is telling me something about my experience that maybe there's something that I need in this moment that I'm not getting, right? Slowing down and getting a little bit curious and then doing that inquiry inside of what am I missing, right? That all of a sudden I'm having this internal reaction or this desire to react in maybe a louder or more visible way. There's something under the surface here for me that is going unmet. And how can I give that to myself?
Yeah, absolutely. And for you, that cultivating that insight in families. Is there something you start with just in terms of sort of unearthing some of that information or that context that can be really valuable for the family, either on an individual basis, someone like a member of the family having better understanding of the cycle, or the family unit as a whole, starting to explicitly name some of those dynamics and develop the insight of what's going on?
Absolutely. So when I'm working with any client, individual or couple, is I'm always going to begin my intakes with a genogram. You can actually, from a therapeutic standpoint, collect a lot more information by drawing a genogram than asking some of the more familiar questions that we're so used to asking. When really we can get a lot more context. We might still get those questions answered, but in a little bit more of a detailed way from the client's perspective of what really sticks out. And then you might see as you drawing the genogram, like some larger patterns and themes that have continued to play out from childhood and then into adulthood, and how that's relating to the current chief complaint or presenting symptoms. So that I think is a really great way to actually gather a lot of information very quickly, all within the first few sessions, sometimes even just the first session. You're going to have a really good picture of what happens in interpersonal relationships and what somebody's maybe go-to protective mechanisms are, and what are the functions of their behavior in those interactions that's keeping that pattern in place, as well as what is the outcome there. That outcome meaning like the symptoms. And even looking at those symptoms in that same sense, how much of that is really reactionary from childhood, maybe some unmet needs or attachment wounds that are coming up today in relationships in adulthood.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do a lot of interpersonal psychotherapy, and conducting an interpersonal inventory is a huge clinical component of that psychotherapeutic framework. So we can really get a snapshot of the client's social support and start to illuminate some of the communication dynamics, the strength in the relationship, the stressors in the relationship. For folks who may be listening that aren't doing genograms as part of their regular clinical practice, could you maybe just talk through how you are orienting clients to that practice, and maybe some of the core things that are important for you to be thinking about when having someone map out their genogram?
Absolutely. So whether genogram or not, it's really a matter, I think, of asking them, okay, who did you grow up with? Who was there? And what did mom and dad do for work? That question right there is going to give you an idea of then who watched you when school was not in session, or who got you off the bus, or who picked you up. That can really open up sometimes or illuminate a lot of maybe some of the little details that we could easily miss. Because did anybody pick you up? Did you get picked up from school, or were people late? And what was that like as a kid? What do you remember that being like? And did you have a sense of not being able to rely on anybody? Okay. Did that change? Was there somebody that you could talk to? So the conversation can evolve even just from asking that first question right then and there. Then when you're going through, it's a matter of, okay, do you have any siblings? Are you close with your siblings? What was your relationship like with your sibling growing up? What did you see in mom and dad's relationship or in your caregiver's relationship? Did they argue often? Did they fight? What was that like? What do you remember about the way that they communicated? Do you also have any memories of them like being intimate in terms of dancing in the kitchen, or mom or dad or caregivers helping one another? And then what if there was a problem? Because even the most healthy, functioning family dynamics, there's always going to be some interpersonal stuff that comes up. What did you witness in the way that they communicated or solved problems? And then how did you fit into that? If there was conflict in the house or amongst siblings and parents, what would happen for you? Would you go to your room? Would you isolate? Would you be the one cracking jokes? Really just trying to get an idea of how that individual functioned within the family system. Who is your support system? And who do you talk to in your current circle, whether it's your friends, siblings? Do you still talk with mom? Do you still talk with dad? What are those relationships like today? And then talking about work, right? Who were you? Who did you need to be within those dynamics? And in what ways are those patterns of behavior still affecting maybe today?
Do you think in that initial relationship building you're doing with your clients, you're focusing primarily on that family of origin, the nuclear family of origin, parents, client, potential siblings, or other people that were living in household, assuming there was housing stability and there was like a unified family dynamic that was consistent through childhood? Were you starting to already get curious about some of those generational patterns of looking into grandparents, maybe other important adults, caregiving figures in a role? I think obviously here in the States, we're often starting sometimes with that presumption of a two-parent household with a child, which is often not the lived experience of so many people we work with. And so how are in those early stages, how much is already that curiosity about generational aspects being planted and discussed?
Oh, absolutely. Those are things as well that like back of mind you're thinking about, right? You're thinking about culture, you're thinking about values, you're thinking about what if, let's say, for example, a client is coming in and they're struggling with their current relationship with their spouse or their partner, right? And then you start to look at or find out certain things about their parents and how their parents acted or in their relationship with one another. There might be patterns that are very similar, right? The overfunctioning parent and the overfunctioning wife, right? Is it a sense of learning that my emotions and my needs were a burden? I couldn't ask for help? Or is it a sense of this is all I knew? When you actually draw it out, whether you're doing a genogram or you're just coming up with your own little diagram of some kind, I think those patterns will really start to emerge when things start to stick out. If you have a client as well who maybe, yeah, parents were divorced or there were a bunch of remarriages and lots of siblings or step siblings or half siblings, you might ask what, it sounds like there was a lot of people coming in and out. What was that like? Or maybe you start to notice that there wasn't a lot of stability. Okay, is that something that maybe you're still looking for, the client might still be looking for or trying to create today? Or is there a sense of being comfortable in the chaos, but in the calm, there's some anxiety that comes up or hypervigilance of what's going to happen next? And then what, in terms of asking about what moms or dads or caregivers' experiences were within their own childhoods, you're also going to start to see that stuff come out in and of itself.
Absolutely. I know you said that sort of in the back of your mind, you're already formulating and thinking about impact of culture or perhaps structural oppressive forces, or if there's was any conflict that the clients more broadly as a family were dealing with, whether it's from displacement or political oppression. I work with a lot of first generation American, things like that. So I think those tend to be important components of conversations that I'm having with folks and understanding their family dynamics. How do you approach sort of conversations about diverse culture, diverse family structures in terms of family cohesion and building that insight that it sounds is really critical to your work?
Yeah. So starting with a lot of the time when you go back and you're asking them, your clients about childhood, it'll sometimes come out that, oh, I'm a first generation immigrant family. And oh, what practices, what values, what cultural influences maybe are within this family dynamic or within your role within the family system, right? If you were the child who spoke English, right, or had to learn English when you got here, what was that like? And did your parents maybe, were they able to attend school meetings or parent-teacher conferences, or were you the translator? In some ways, are you still that person in between? Who did you rely on? Who did you feel close to? Who did you feel protected you? So going back to some of them, I think main core themes, it really, I think, is about safety and belonging and acceptance. And then what are some, also big thematic words like protection, being able to rely on somebody. Where does that show up? And when those things maybe weren't easily met, what are the things that you would do, right, in those interactions? Whether it was maybe you never thought about it before, or it subconsciously was something that you did in the moment in order to find that or have that need be met.
Are there moments in set therapy that you are sensing that a generational pattern is being interrupted or is being transformed? And what does that look like? And how are you fostering that, encouraging that, naming that psychotherapeutically with folks?
So I've seen that happen. I've seen it where it's emerged, but I think it's takes a little bit of time for some change to have happen. One of the things that I often will talk with my clients about is we have locks on our doors for reasons, right? We have passwords on our computer for reasons. A lot of our protective mechanisms are in place because that's the way that we've kept ourselves safe or that we had our needs met. So, first, it's a matter of recognizing that going to this place for clients is not always easy. Having clients open up their door, right, and be receptive maybe to therapy is going to be for the first and foremost challenge. So building that trust and that reciprocal connection with your clients is going to be key. And then helping them come to be more confident that we don't have to operate within that sense of insecurity anymore. It can be a little bit of a slower process for some, but where you'll start to see it is in communication, is in their practices of assertiveness in their current relationships, their ability to set and maintain healthy boundaries, and also working with self-compassion so that clients can know that this isn't necessarily an easy thing to rewrite because perhaps for all these years, this is how you've known to relate to others.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you say more about the role of compassion work in this process? How are you integrating compassion-based interventions, and why is that critical to, it sounds like differentiation is something that you're working very much on in these family systems, that ability to identify one needs and one value and assess if those role dynamics are still serving them in the way that it did maybe initially to keep them attached to caregivers.
Yeah. So the first one of the things to think about here is the sense of clients will often come, and this is my experience, and this is what I've seen for after a number of years, is the clients will often focus, especially nowadays with a lot of the immediate gratification that we're so used to, a sense of urgency to fix, resolve, or this distressing experience to just go away. And sometimes that comes up as internalized anger or self blame or frustration, or even just blame towards others, right? A sense of maybe looking for justification for maybe not feeling validated. And so, in that, it's a little bit of looking at what's driving this sense of needing to fix, needing to resolve, needing that sense of urgent validation from someone else. What's really at the root of that? Is it a sense of not feeling, yes, not feeling validated, of not feeling heard, of not feeling seen? Modeling that maybe perhaps for the first time for the client, where it always needed to be around a certain emotional experience or around what may be happening interpersonally in the relationships today. Modeling that and helping clients to really have all of their feelings about other people, looking at what are your emotions telling you about something, again, that you need that you're not getting? And maybe when was the last time that need really was fulfilled? How did you feel when you were a kid when this kind of situation arose? Perhaps you needed that then too. Whatever it is that's missing now is what you needed then, and you were just a kid. So even just in another thing I like to ask my clients is, say we were watching this scenario, right? That is very much rooted in a similar experience from childhood. Say we were watching that on a movie screen or reading about it in a book of this little child experiencing the same thing. What might they be experiencing internally? You're watching it all on a screen. And having the client describe it from more of an externalized standpoint, that's where you start to see compassion emerge. Why can't you have that same compassion for yourself? If the child in that scenario on the movie screen or in the story, you're able to provide or have empathy or compassion for that child, then you were that kid. You were that kid once, and maybe you need that. You've needed that sense of empathy and compassion then. How can you extend that to yourself?
And what role does the compassion flowing outward or in this dynamic when we're thinking about generational patterns? Do you think that compassion work towards caregivers, extended family members, et cetera, is also integral to the work? And what does that
Oh,
look like?
absolutely. Yeah. So when we think about the perceptions that we sometimes have of people in our past or even people in our current life, it's very much based upon what we're seeing in the surface. But when we start to look at that there's more to the story, right? That maybe the label you have for yourself or negative self talk, if any, that you have for yourself, it's based upon something else underneath the surface, right? Or the family dynamic is not as black and white, right? As the way that maybe younger you made sense of it, that there's more to the story here, then why wouldn't there be more to the story for mom and dad? We're looking at what are some of the reasons maybe the caregivers responded in these types of ways. Did they have the tools? Did they have the insight? Did they have the strategy that maybe you have today? Okay, maybe not. Survival took of the family dynamic in terms of food and safety and shelter took precedence, right? Was there a lot of trauma in our parents' lives? Were they modeled the things that maybe you needed that you didn't get? So they were children once too. So the compassion for caregivers or family of origin is just as important, but I think it can't necessarily be accessed until it's accessed internally. Really, everything begins within. So, in that sense of if we're maybe judging, what might I be judging about myself? And so, if I'm able to now have more patience and more compassion for myself, I might have more ability to have more compassion and empathy for others because we're going to learn that there's more to the story.
Are there challenges that come up for you if you're working with someone who may not have as much knowledge beyond the observed behavior of people in their life? Perhaps they don't know mom's experience of what her childhood was like. Perhaps they don't have that context, or there was some sort of family disruption through loss, like incarceration, displacement, death, or something, and they don't have access potentially to the material that would help them further contextualize maybe some of the generational patterns. How do you work through maybe some of those pieces when maybe it feels like there's unknowable information that might support that broader conceptualization of what's happening? Because I think what I see for a lot of folks who struggle is in the absence of that content and that knowing or being able to understand, a lot of it gets attributed to their own self-worth.
Mhm.
I must not be lovable enough. I must not be worthy enough. I just maybe it must be inherently bad to have caused and created because perhaps mom is not disclosing she was sexually abused by her father. And that is translating into her own attachment towards her son, just for an example, something like that.
Absolutely. So in that sense, I think your question is a perfect example of beginning within, right? And using the therapeutic relationship as an example or modeling. So in that scenario, I think it would be a matter first of processing emotions and sitting with the client in that experience of what does that really mean of maybe searching, wanting, or needing all of the context information. What is it like to not have all of that information and kind of sit in the discomfort of that? Because it's another example we could provide some sort of lived experience of soothing that the client might not have gotten, especially around, which is very similar maybe as a kid, you didn't have those ability to really be able to understand what your experience was. So here we are now, an adult, and still struggling with the same thing. What's that like? I mean, I'm here with you in that process. What is that like to say that out loud or to share that experience here with me? Using relational techniques in that way to call out the connection that we're building and creating together from therapist to client. You really making it known, okay, this is what safety can feel like. Okay, when you first came in, you were struggling with this scenario of either your child or somebody in your life acting in a certain kind of way that is, but there's more on the surface. Sure, we can label it as a behavior, like inherently someone being lazy or selfish or uncaring, but then we actually look at that a little bit and like what ways of maybe you labeled yourself, but what was actually going on under the surface was being overwhelmed of not having support, of the experience being overwhelming or confusing and not knowing how to sit in that space or move forward. Okay, if that was your experience, or if that's something that you've come to learn about somebody who is close to you now, isn't it quite possible that maybe mom or dad or caregiver could have had something else going on that we don't know about? When we were kids, we only saw things on the surface, right? We didn't have that bird's eye view, and our caregivers didn't talk about it. Why didn't they talk about it? That's an interesting thing to think about too. And here we are today talking about it, right? Breaking one part of the pattern.
Yeah. I know you said the genogram is really essential to start illuminating some of this and start having that curiosity and building some of that insight. And it sounds like you do a lot around some interpersonal effectiveness, like helping people with self-advocacy and boundary setting. Are any other clinical modalities or specific clinical interventions that you feel like really map onto this work or complement this work that you're doing and supporting folks around understanding these generational patterns and how to liberate themselves from it?
Absolutely. So a relational approach for sure, or even noticing what's happening within the therapist client relationship from a transference point of view. Our relationship that we're building with our clients is really a microcosm of what might be happening in other relationships. So keeping that stance of I'm here with you in the dark cave, but also I have the ability, like I'm climbing up out of that cave at the same time, and I'm looking at it from bird's eye view, knowing all of this stuff about context, history, family of origin, early social learnings, protective mechanisms at play, things that I've gained about my client up until this point, and then I'm joining you back into the cave of your experience and then stepping back outside of it and looking at it from all perspectives. But considering that the relationship that you're building with your client really truly is just a small little snippet of what's happening potentially in other relationships. So if there's a sense of someone, your client kind of keeping you at arm's length or giving you snippets of information, or perhaps there's tension or internal conflict for the client in terms of making changes or building motivation for change, where else and how else might that be showing up in their lives and other relationships?
Very interesting. So I mentioned that I do a lot of interpersonal psychotherapy, which is a relational therapy, but I think where it differs a little bit from the work you're doing is it's explicitly a non-transferential psychotherapy approach, meaning there's a clinical understanding of the transference dynamics happening, but they're not used as a clinical intervention. And the therapeutic stance of an IPG therapist is almost wanting to model secure attachment. And so we're being that cheerleader, someone to promote a positive model of self in the client, but also try to emulate a positive model of others through the therapeutic relationship. So we're never like really explicitly exploring the transference in the therapeutic relationship. We're getting curious about it, noticing it, and then seeing how it may apply to other relationships and using that to cultivate and call out broader patterns that may be happening. But since sort of the work you're doing is, it sounds like, more transferential in nature, what are the ways that you're engaging in conversation about the therapeutic relationship and what's coming up?
So, in that sense, when transference comes up, right, it is a matter of noticing it and then even then getting curious, like you said, about why might this be happening within the context or the client's lens of their experience in the world. Why might this be happening? What are we talking about? What have we been talking about lately? Is it relate to potentially something that is triggering or rubbing up against the past in some way, shape, or form? Perhaps we've reached a new level of closeness that they've not achieved in any other relationship, or now we're really talking about a certain subject, right? And what might be going on here for the client. The other piece of it too is what am I noticing in this interaction with the client? Even looking at what am I feeling? And is that something that maybe the client is feeling too? what's happening dynamically between us as well and calling that out, getting really curious about how that relates. So, in terms of when you look at the family of origin, what role, if any, is maybe or part is being triggered here in this conversation now that rubs up against childhood?
For clinicians listening, are there things that we should be being thoughtful about and signs within ourselves that we might be reenacting generational patterns that could show up in the therapy room? What is your sort of system for checking in on yourself on that? Or what would you advise for other clinicians that are really curious about doing this sort of work?
Absolutely. We're humans too, right? And so one of the things I like to say when I think about relationships, any kind of relationship, is that we're dancing with each other. We're dancing with each other's stuff all the time. Somebody brings a certain energy or emotion into session, you're sitting with that too, right? And having an energetic reaction to it. In terms of checking in with yourself, considering what's going on for me in this interaction. Am I uncomfortable about this particular subject? Or am I feeling frustrated? How much of that maybe belongs to me versus my client? So I'll give you an example is say that as the clinician, you're having a family therapy session or a couples counseling session, right? And there you are, for whatever reason, because of what's playing out in the room, you feel unheard or your interventions are just not going anywhere. Perhaps there's a sense of, whoa, like my clients might each individually be feeling that as well. So that's an example of checking in and then also using what's coming up for you to maybe interrupt what's happening, right? Or to call that out. I'm wondering if you guys, I'm feeling really unheard right now. And I'm wondering if that's how you feel as well. And that's just a way to interrupt and then also relate to your client's experience. And that's going to shift the conversation into even a sense of when was the last time that you felt heard by one another? What was different about that scenario versus this scenario? When did you really start happening that you each maybe feel unheard versus more connected and understood? We're instead of getting lost in the details of the conflict in and of itself, we're talking about the broader strokes here that are just continually coming up. That's one example of checking in is like when you feel like you're having an emotional reaction in general, how can you use that? How much of that belongs to me and how much of that is useful? Like saying it and calling it out from there.
And what advice would you give to therapists that kind of help clients move from insight to action? So, how are we translating some of that awareness into lasting changes that are tangible in daily life? And maybe also just thinking more broadly in, things like symptom reduction. Because I imagine just like in the paradigm we're treating clients, oftentimes we recognize that the patterns of behavior are keeping them stuck, are making their life small, or reducing the quality of their health and their relationships. But they may be coming in the door because they're depressed, or they're coming in the door because they're anxious, or they're in high conflict with their spouse, or some adjustment issues from a move or something like that. So, can you talk a little bit about anything else that would be like really important, tangible takeaways of how we help clients mobilize this into tangible behavior change?
Absolutely. And that's the other thing is that when our clients come in, considering like that, they're struggling to the point of seeking help at this point in time, right? They're really maybe dysregulated. We're stuck in a certain emotion. So, in that sense, if we're using this kind of lens or approach, okay, perhaps there's some part from childhood or inner child that is been triggered or been stuck for a long time. In that sense, it is important that we're working on coping skills, self-regulation skills in order to even sometimes get to some of these insights and being that sense of that grounded force for them through some of these challenges. Those are things that are happening, I think, inherently throughout. So it's not just about helping the client gain insight. It's about the therapist kind of being the model or the tool for a sense of groundedness, as well as we're talking about some of these deeper things that are at the core here, right? The other piece of that is like when clients gain insight, you're right, that sometimes there's a sense of, okay, I learned this really hard thing about myself. Now what? What's the point? So then there's a sense of, okay, so we know now what's the path that or reflexive path that comes up when these situations happen. what do we want to do differently? Right? And waiting for what the client's response is. Because then we're going to get the clear picture of what it is that they hope to achieve, right? We work on goals and treatment planning, obviously, in the beginning, but I think at the same time, helping the client see that you have now options here. We've got this insight. So what do you want to do differently? And then from there, it's a matter of providing options that match to the client in terms of what maybe is going to work for them, meeting them at their level and also empowering them to make the decision of, okay, so how do you want to maybe relate differently to this person in your life or to yourself the next time something complicated comes up, rather than me just giving the options to the client. I'm helping them choose and helping them maybe pick a path that works best for them or matches where they are at that point in time. And I think it's a matter still of just modeling for the client of how they could talk to themselves instead, or how they could respond to themselves instead. And then sometimes what I've seen too is like we reach this point of gained insight, but there's maybe a little bit of resistance around making that change, around applying new strategies or new skills. Why? What is that about? I'm giving up something that has kept me safe or has helped me make it through up until all these years until now. So you're asking me to let go of this belief that I hold about myself. Sometimes there's a fear around what that means. Then who am I without this negative belief? So it's a matter, I think, of rolling with the resistance at the same time and allowing the client to release some of those old beliefs that are no longer working for them.
Manifest in clients sometimes having to make decisions to end relationships with members of the family to really forge new pathways forward. I guess one of the challenges I've seen has sometimes been to change will mean disconnection. To change will mean I can no longer be attached. And I think there's a lot of ways this comes up. I do work a lot with gender diverse folks. And for some people, that's the reality, to live authentically as themselves, to step in line with their values, and to challenge these generational patterns. In doing that, there will be loss potentially, and there will be disconnection. And sometimes it's looked like being rejected by family or electing to go no contact with family. So I'm curious for you, is that something that like you're finding in sometimes in the work, right? But for those cases where that may be the reality, is there anything that you're thinking about as a clinician of like how to navigate those circumstances?
Yeah, yeah. And this is, I think, one of those scenarios that is highly individual, right? Because I think especially nowadays where we do have a lot of information right at our fingertips, and a lot of clients are on social media, and there's a lot of reels and podcasts out there talking about just ending relationships or cutting people off. It's something to consider that it's a highly individualized decision, right? And the client is ultimately going to do what's best for them in terms of safety, because this is a matter of cutting people off, ending relationships, ending that. It's a matter sometimes of safety, but other times it could fuel or feed the sense of cutting people off or running from something that's uncomfortable. So I think the way that I like to frame it is it might mean no longer being attached, but maybe it's more of a matter of no longer being attached in the way that you currently are. Maybe it's really about releasing the wish for that closeness with this person and working towards the acceptance of what the relationship is. So perhaps it looks different. Perhaps you look different within that dynamic, right? Perhaps it is a matter of expressing boundaries and feeling confident to express that boundary, but it doesn't mean that the relationship necessarily has to end. Now, if it's a matter of safety, that's a different issue in and of itself.
Anything else you'd like our listeners to take away from this conversation?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is that you are the tool. You can be the tool, right? The safety that you build with your clients really is, I think, the cornerstone of the healing process. And you're the model for what is possible in relationships. And now that doesn't mean we validate everything. It's not a matter of we don't want to validate unhealthy things, but it is a matter of being a sense of maybe grounded support or compass for our clients.
Thank you for joining our community on the Affirming Minds podcast. If you love this episode as much as we did, please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts and share it on your socials. If you want more information about how this podcast can add to your continuing education credits, visit affirmmentalhealth.com. And remember, let's affirm, heal, and grow together.